Thanks again, Kelly. As we move into our family succession planning or non-family succession planning, as the case may be, this is a picture of our family and the recent, only not so recent addition anymore. The little guy on the right is going to actually be 2 in June. So for those of you that have that role already of being a grandparent, you'll know what a big change change to the operation that is. You know, everybody's alluding to it, that they have the situation coming down the pike at them, and even the stats support that. Farm Management Canada did a survey recently that said that 75% of the operations are going to transition in the next 10 years, and only 8% of them have a plan. So I think, you know, as we look forward, it's more and more important all the time to figure out what's the best way for us. And certainly, as we talk about the importance of coming together and creating that common vision, and you know, that it just seems like a really good starting point. And I don't know if many actually make a practice of really talking about what they want the operation to look like in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. And that can be including everyone, not just the farming children or those that are going to take over, but really think about the importance of why you are going to be doing that and what you want it to look like. One of the questions we help and put as a prompt sometimes is, you know, if you knew that you wouldn't fail, or you had all the time and the money in the world, what would you like to create for yourself and your farm and your family? Dr. John Fast is the fellow who came up with these ideas about the importance of the common vision. He's worked a lot with families in business, and that stresses the piece about unity, inspiration, and motivation, providing the core principles and guidelines, and then also guiding the individual growth and development of members. You know, because we have to remember, it's not only people coming in, it's also people exiting or transitioning out. And I think it's important to keep both of those in mind as far as what their new roles are going to look like. This also provides a change model for us to figure out how we're going to navigate through this. This next diagram is actually developed by a fellow by the name of Simon Sinek. You won't necessarily hear of him in agriculture circles, but he's quite popular in the leadership, management, personal growth arena. And he says that the most effective organizations, teams, and families make sure that they spend a lot of time at that center of this, which he calls the golden circle. So with why do we do what we do? And on there, you'll note the asterisks. He says most people never answer that question. We talk about what we do and how we're going to do it, the outer circles, but not so much at the why. And I think that's another important thing to keep in mind as we're starting to create these succession plans, is why are we doing this in the first place? Everybody will have different opinions and thoughts on it, but it's a good question to share and determine as we navigate where we're going to go. A colleague of mine shares a story that before they spent time asking about why they were ranching, they were really getting a lot of conflict about the how to do things between him and his father, because they both had differing opinions on what were best strategies. But once they came back to the bigger question about why are we actually doing it, it certainly helped them along the way. So we talk about going to so far as to develop a mission statement and asking these questions. It's carrying on with what we were talking about with Simon Sinek's golden circle, but why does your farm ranch operation exist? What do you want to be known for? What do you want the relationships to look like, both internal and external? How will your organization relate to your industry, your own families, your employees in the wider world? And what does your operation strive for? So, you can even just think about that as, if you have a moment to jot some of those down, if you want some takeaway questions to go back and share with members of your team to have some conversations. I think that's an important piece that we can use to enhance our planning. So I'll just leave that up for a minute. Something else I will say, that at the end, if anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to share it with you. And then you can share it with some of the other members of your team. This diagram that I now have up is called the 3-circle model. And I've learned about that with my families in business learning and work. And it certainly doesn't just apply to us in farms and ranches, but also to any kind of family business. So really looking at those 3 circles and where they overlap to determine where people are. So you'll see that circle number 1 at the top, it relates to people who are involved in the ownership of the business, but who are not family members and not involved in the conduct of the business. Number 2, the bottom right hand, relates to the family members who have no ownership in the business and also do not work in the business. Number 3, going to the left, people in this category work in the business, but they're not family and they're not involved in ownership. Then you will see up on the top where 1 and 2 intersect is number 4. These are family members who have an ownership, but are not employed by the business. Moving straight across to the left to number 5, relates to the opposite, people who have ownership and are involved in the business, but they're not family members. 6, going down, the family members who work in the business, but they aren't involved in the ownership. Number 7 relates to family members who have ownership rights and work in the business. Number 8 is outside of all 3. Those are other stakeholders who aren't family, have no ownership rights, but they might be involved, having an interest in the business. I think in farming, lots of times that will be other landowners that we rent land from. Maybe it's suppliers or businesses that we collaborate with. So even though that seems a little bit convoluted, one of the pieces that's been very helpful for me as we have planning conversations is to figure out, well, which circle are people in? And then it's easier to clarify the boundaries around discussions. So if it's specifically an ownership conversation, who falls in that circle? And I think it won't always be this complicated, but particularly as we're going forward, if we can make a designation about, okay, this conversation that we're about to have is about the family. So a family member would be involved in that, but others that aren't won't necessarily be part of that conversation. And I think it's a good way to approach it as far as thinking about, okay, who actually has the decision-making capabilities in those different areas. There's family members that won't work in the business. So when we're having a business conversation, how the business is operated, how it's ran, they won't necessarily be involved in that conversation. Maybe, in our case, one of the there's an ownership and a family piece would be my mom, because she owns some of the land, but she's not actively involved in the business. But of course, she is a family member. So keeping those pieces in mind. Another thing, and there's no wrong way or right way to discern this, is that whether it's a family first operation or a business first operation. And there's many examples of both. And again, it's not wrong or right, but just trying to determine, what is the most important thing here? Is it the family or the business? And a good thing to have a conversation about. Then, of course, getting to the listening and the communication piece. How good are we at communicating? I think as humans, we aren't that good. Somewhere along the line, most of it is miscommunication. And I also read where somebody said that is why we have two ears and one mouth, because we should listen twice as much as we talk. There was an interview recently about the Mr. Rogers movie that Tom Hanks played Mr. Rogers in, and it was interviewing him and asking him for some insight. And one of the things that he had learned from learning more about Mr. Rogers was the acronym WAIT, WAIT, why am I talking? And I thought that that was a helpful and powerful one to think about as we move forward. So some of the pieces, also are how are we dealing with conflict? Is it something that you're good at or comfortable with? Not always the case, I don't think. And what about thinking further beyond that, about our contingency plan? Do we have the conversation about the worst case scenario, and how are we going to deal with that? I think that in many cases that can be a starting point, but it's also certainly the most difficult. Nobody wants to think about the what ifs, about someone not being there in the room anymore, but it is an important piece for us to talk about. So when we think about listening, there's a few things that go into that communication piece. Making sure that we're listening and not over talking, practicing non-judgment, showing understanding of what the people are talking about, being totally there. I think in this age of tech and so many interruptions and distractions, it's very hard to always be present, but something that we should make a point of being. Making sure that the first response is not personal. It needs to relate to the speaker. Letting go of the results. It's not a competition. And above all, don't harm. We're trying to be kind and compassionate. Patty Duran from FCC talked about some different strategies that you might need to use if the conflict gets high. And one of that is to pause. If things are getting heated, it's simply okay to take a break and go away and say, okay, we're just going to go and cool down a bit, and then we will come back. She also talks about making sure you prepare and writing things down. So you really know that for the important things, if you have trouble speaking off the cuff, that you do some preparation, writing it down, and also practice it. So maybe there's somebody that you trust that you can run by some of the ideas. There's a communication model that I learned long ago, developed by a fellow by the name of Jack Gibbs. And as you can see at the bottom of this, there is the level of trust and acceptance. From there, communication, goals, and at the top, control. And you can see that very little control is needed. There's a strong base from which to develop good communication and goals. But when we think about it, so many of the organizations we belong to are often the inverse of this. So they don't have a strong base, and it's really easy to topple them over. So much of the work that we do with people and families is a lot of exercises to help build trust and acceptance. So we do have good communication. So we talk about the steps that are actually involved for putting a succession plan together. And so the first one is step one, building that emotional bank account with your family. The second step is thinking about how you will decide on your succession plan. So with a group, there's four ways of deciding. There's command, consensus, consulting, or convenience. And at the end of the day, it's important to discern which of these we are actually going to go through. Okay, here, hang on. There we go. Step three, to appoint a succession planning leader, a quarterback, a person who has the willingness and commitment to lead the succession planning process. And one of the strategies that often happens is whoever that leader is meets with members or member couples of the family individually to get a sense of what people are thinking about, what might be some challenges, and if there's certain outcomes that they're hoping for. The fifth step that we talk about is to hold a succession planning family meeting at a time that is reasonable for everyone. And certainly that is getting more difficult to do all the time. People are very busy and have a lot of commitments, besides the farm, their other jobs, their families. And, that certainly is a challenge for trying to figure out a time when everybody can come together. And then making sure for step six that each person is given equal time to share their responses. I think that it's often better to be inclusive than exclusive. And people talk about, well, who should we include? Should we just include the kids? Should we just include the spouses? Or, just the kids and not worry about the spouses? But anytime you can, I think that it's better to have everyone there. When we go back to the idea of effective communication, when you think about the fact that if it has been a difficult or challenging conversation, and now a spouse, a daughter-in-law or son-in-law is going to learn about it via their partner and not being there in person, I think it's just better the more direct communication. It's still so important to realize that everybody interprets things differently, and taking some time to understand that. Then once you've gone through all those pieces, you can often start sharing the data with the professionals and consultants that I mentioned earlier. They're going to be involved in the process. And then it really is up to the parents, I think, to draft that initial plan and then go back and share with the rest of the family about what it's going to look like. There's so many different layers of it, because there's going to be, there's the ownership piece when we think back to that families and business model, but there's also the management piece. And are we preparing the next generation to be allowed to, learn and surface the competencies and the skills that they have? So then there's also the estate planning piece of it, where what about what's going to happen for the non-farm children, and how are they being looked after? So all those different pieces can get quite involved as you're trying to figure it out. And it's complicated. Our operations have grown so much over time in the last number of years, and the values are so high. Again, I think often the off-farm kids, living in the city, look at a balance sheet or know what the values of the land and the machinery and the livestock are, and they're very high. So sometimes different expectations happen. When we start talking about sharing the management piece of it, I was talking to a banker that works with a number of families the other day, and she was saying there's kind of two fears that she often sees with talking about the financial piece, and it's so important. And one is that the senior generation doesn't want to share all the finances because it's not as good as they had hoped, and there's some negativity around that. Or the inverse, when they think that if the younger generation, without having been through the school of hard knocks, sees a really profitable um, farm, that then they might spend foolishly. So it's often different, controlling or hanging on to it for different reasons. And it's often based on those different fears. But she also went on to say, if somebody's starting to make decisions about, what kind of parts are we buying for the machinery, if they don't have a good sense of the overall financial plan, it's really hard for them to be able to do that. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and talks about, do the best with what you have where you are. And I think that we all are in different situations. There's no doubt about it. And there isn't going to be one perfect answer. But I think the more conversations that we can have about what the future might look like for our operation, then the better off we're going to be. Certainly there's a number of different things I've seen over the years. A couple of families I saw and had worked with, they actually left it up to the children and said, okay, you guys are going to be the ones taking this over. You have to make sure you look after us, the parents, with whatever income that needs to be. But as far as the division, you guys figure it out. And so and then come back with a plan. So the kids did go, and they came back with plan A. And the dad said, well, that's pretty good, but he had a couple of points that he wasn't so sure about. So he sent them back to rework the plan. And then the second one, they came back and they approved it. There's certainly others that where the parents or the founders will have more direction about how things are going to be, and that is helpful as well. Another family I worked with, there had been starting to get a little bit of dissension. It was a blended family because one of the daughters had was given a parcel of land on which to build a house. And there was some perception with the siblings, well, why is that happening? But then when the family all came together and started talking about it, and the parents shared that the intent was they were able to provide for each of the kids to have a spot or a piece of land if they wanted to use it as an asset, or just to build on it. But again, having the conversation where the expectations and is known what is going to happen, then everybody was much more comfortable after that. There, in another case where they started talking about this with younger kids that were still in high school at the time, and the parents had always wanted to provide the opportunity, but they didn't want the kids to feel like they had to come back to the farm. I think that's often the case. And when they started talking about their goals and visions for the future, one of the sons was really in a quandary because he was feeling quite a bit of pressure to come back to the farm. And the father was quite surprised at that because he had never intended to put pressure. In fact, it was the opposite. They didn't want them to feel obligated to come back. Um, in another transition, they did it between the farm and the non-farm, was that over time, as the son who was actively involved in the farming, each year he got a percentage of ownership in exchange for the sweat equity. So after, I believe it was 10% a year. And so after 10 years, the ownership had transitioned to him, and then his off-farm sister was looked after in another way. The and certainly, as was mentioned at the beginning, sometimes it's transitioning to non-family, and how do you make that work with somebody that still makes it fair and equitable to the, and maybe I should just say fair, because fair and equal certainly aren't the same thing, but for the ownership will stay within the family, but the management might not. And I think as people proceed, having lots of clarity on expectations, timelines, and roles and responsibilities, and what's that going to look like? And even sometimes, when we don't know, it's okay to be saying that. We don't know what it's going to look like in 5 years, because frankly, I have a very hard time thinking about not living on this farm. In another ranching family, they were very inclusive. And when the two sons both got married, there was the parents, the two sons, and the daughter-in-laws, and everybody received a sixth of the operation. So, again, a whole bunch of different ways that you can go about and accomplish some of these things. So, I've thrown out a few ideas. Another example that I once heard of with it was actually Merle Good, who probably many of you know, as they were trying to figure out values, was taking the farming wage versus an off farm but comparable wage, and the differential, multiplying that by however many years had been invested in the farm. There's nothing exact on that, I don't think, that's going to work to help people figure out an exact equation, but it can be one that really will make people think of that value of that sweat equity. In farming, in many cases, it isn't a big wage that is being drawn, but a lot of hard work goes into it too. I think that there's an idea that we have, that we've built these operations up into such a way, a size, and the production model, and that it needs to transfer exactly like that. But as the seniors or the parents, I think we need to look at kind of dispelling that idea, because these kids that are coming up have a lot of creative ideas and innovation. They're smart, and they aren't going to do the same things as we did. And trying to realize that, it's not going to look the same. And maybe there is opportunities for other off-farm or less involved kids, that to own a piece, or, maybe there's such a growth in the direct food production that, having access to a small amount of land might be an important piece of it to figure out how it's going to work as they move down the road. Also talking about, agreements where the ownership might be in the off-farm members, but there's a rental agreement to the farming sibling, or those kind of things, that I also had seen another one where there was concern about the value of the land and if it would increase. And the idea that if one of the children got a certain value, and then turn around and sold it, but just having some agreements in place that if that did happen within a set amount of time, then they needed to share the proceeds or the profits with their siblings. So, and certainly none of this is getting down the pieces about the technical side with the capital gains and what those kind of implications might be. Of course, if it is a qualified farm property, then it can transition to the next generation tax free. But at some point in time, it may not stay that way. And certainly as we're hearing more rumblings all the time that maybe those capital gains exemptions are going to change, because those of us in farming do have quite a good advantage for that. So, I think going back to the ideas that trying to sit down and really think about, okay, let's get specific. It's now 2021, and in 5 years, what do we want this operation to look like? And start on a personal level. So by 2026, how old will you be? What will you be doing for work? What will you be doing for fun? Where would you like to live? Who are the people around you? And then from that, at its very best, really try to think of it from the idea of the fairy godmother waving the magic wand. And then going to the next step, okay, if this is personally how I want things to be, then what can the operation at its very best look like? And then you can all come back and create that shared vision about what it might look like. And again, it won't always go easy, but trying to put the pieces together where people see that they've been involved, they've been acknowledged, and figuring out who the decision makers are too. So there's so many different strategies, like I say, but coming together and trying to have those important conversations. And even if it's starting up with, often is the case where the parents will say, we don't know what to do, but we've got to do something. So let's come together and hear where people are coming from. Because, in some cases, there is the hope that other children will come back to the farm that aren't there now. But having a frank conversation about, that isn't going to happen. So, what are we going to do? Is it going to be a matter of selling the operation and the assets, or how can we transition it? So again, in 50 minutes there, we've shared a lot of different thoughts and ideas. And now I would like to open it up to, if people have questions or shared experiences, Kelly can take off the mute button and we can have more of a conversation. So I'm just going to go to, for one second, there is my contact information, but I can minimize that and stop screen sharing. And get Kelly to, I don't know if everybody has to unmute themselves, or if Kelly's the one that does that for us, or if there's questions, questions in the chat box. I don't see anything currently. Pat, I see that, you were unmuted and then you were muted again. The other, we talked about it being a process and a journey, the idea that this is going to be one meeting where we miraculously solve everything, I don't think is going to be the case. And, I also would share a story with someone else that they knew they'd had to do something and they'd been dreading. But then when they actually did it and sat down, and spent a day really talking about different possibilities and what was important, at the end of the day, both parents were, I just can't believe how much better that was than they thought it was going to be. So Pat, do you have questions or comments or insights from some of your experiences?
I'm not quite sure. We have some difficulty determining this, how much the sweat equity is worth. I mean, how do you do that? Okay, so we have a couple that are joining our operation, and it's really hard to put a number on that. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, well, that one example I used where, maybe it's a matter of coming up with a percentage and just saying, we feel that this would take, and I'm just throwing this out there, I don't know if that's the best way, 10 years. And then maybe it doesn't have to be so specifically tied to hours and then a wage to the hours, that's just kind of, so then, because otherwise when you put the hours, and it might be appropriate in some cases, but an hour, and then, okay, well, what would the wage be comparable? But then when people aren't agreeing on that or meeting similar expectations, or there's differing, maybe just a percentage and saying this is going to take X years and we're going to do it that percentage at a time. I don't know. Does that seem like another way maybe to look at it?
Yeah, but what's the final thing then? I mean, then at the end of those 10 years, the new owners have taken over and the old owners don't have any equity in that anymore. Yeah, it's really hard. Hey, I mean, that's kind of where we're at right now. I don't know if you remember the kind of path that you set us on, where we were paying them in the number of cows every year.
Yes. Yeah.
And that sounded like a really good idea, but it ended up being that then, instead of it being wages we were paying out, which would have been an expense for us, it became an income because we were giving them these cows. So that became kind of a problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I can totally see that and maybe it's a situation, being mindful of that, of whether something is showing up as an expense or a sale or income, but also trying to determine at the end of the day, if there is still going to be some ownership retained, what's that going to look like? So over 10 years, these quarters or whatever could be yours, this amount of land, but then the other stays with you, and there's some kind of long-term lease that would transition the assumption, to the land that's kept for your kids.
That's kind of the path that we're looking at now, is some, where maybe at some point the other family's going to have to start renting grass from us, right?
Yes.
Ours, it's the land base is primarily ours.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We need to have you come again and talk to her.
So the piece, I think of, again, that expectations, if we're, and interpretations, it can be quite different, and without really sitting down and hearing and being intentional about it, we get busy in our operations, and pretty soon months and years have gone by, without always dealing with some of these things. And I also think, in a situation, even though they aren't family, they're very much like family, and that sometimes human nature, we tend to be a bit more formal, if that's the right word, when we're working with people that we're not related to. It's so easy to take and I'm not thinking of you guys specifically, but just the way families function, that sometimes we make a lot of assumptions within our own family that aren't necessarily the case. But it's not easy, is it?
No, we do try to keep meeting. Our goal was to meet once a month, and unfortunately that doesn't happen. But you know, our mindset is that we need to talk to each other more. So that's something we have to work on, making that a priority, because it's so easy to let those meetings slip by if you're busy.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. And I learned something the other day, or heard of, where they were, oh geez, now my internet connection is telling me it's unstable. If I need to, I'll stop my video. Um, anyway, where they had instead of doing the meetings monthly, they were actually doing them quarterly, because that kind of fit with the growing season. And plus, it put a little bit, because it was just so hard to do the monthly meetings, especially, in the spring when it's super busy. So I thought, that was a good way of doing it. And in that time, they were also reviewing finances, and you have enough of a chunk of finances, underway to hopefully help with that.
right. That's probably a good idea.
Mhm.
I'll let somebody else talk.
Okay, well, thanks for your input. And yeah, thank you for letting me pick on you to go first. So
Oh, I
I
don't mind.
guess what would be some other experiences or questions that anybody would have? Trevor and your dad, you guys have, Trevor and Phil, you have two screens. Do you have any comments or questions that you'd like to share? And you do have to unmute on the bottom left. There we go.
Um, Not overly. We're just starting this journey. We have a farm brother who lives out of country, and so we're just figuring out how to navigate that.
Yeah, that certainly makes it tricky, but technology has helped a lot. And actually, a number of years ago, I worked with a family where I can't even remember what the platform was. Our middle daughter lives in New Zealand, and so I did conversations. I mean, obviously, it's not face to face, but definitely helps for sure. Thanks. Kelly must have stopped that because maybe I was getting a little draggy there. Mark, I see that you're unmuted. Do you have questions or comments?
No questions, I don't think. Anyway, I guess my comment would be, I was in the auction business for 25 years, so I saw a lot of retiring farmers or family farms being taken over by other people or by family. And you know what? I think the person has to remember that it's not rocket science, right? So you have to be realistic about everything, and you have to keep communicating is the big thing, right? And find some common ground to start with, I think, and yeah, you can make it happen, So yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really appreciate that. What would you say, with that's great insight and experience you have, what would you say, about the challenges that the senior, especially the men, right, the fathers have from exiting or letting go?
Well, I think the big thing that I've experienced in my 30 years in the auction and seeing some people exiting farming is these the generations that farm now. I mean, the older farmers are thought a lot differently than the younger ones now, but the is that, you know what, we're going to give you the reins, but we're kind of only going to give you one, so we're really never offering to let go completely. So that's one thing that has to be really thought out carefully and worked on.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. How about Fred? Do you have any questions or comments? And making sure to unmute your mic on the bottom left.
Well, my situation is that I'm getting too old to farm, and I actually don't have anyone to take over. I have three daughters, uh, they're they've left, and we're alone here on the farm now.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's got good jobs, making, you know, some are professional jobs, and so that uh, it would seem like I don't have a big operation. Um, got 6 quarters of land,
Mm-hmm.
and we're just doing hay production right now. But anyway, what it is that there are divorces involved, and so then you have situations where you have, uh, well, what it turns out, what it all boils down to is I don't want to sell any land.
Yeah.
Uh, the land was all homesteaded and cleared and so forth by my grandfather and my father, and with my help and so forth, and yet I'm getting too old to continue, and there really isn't any kind of magic bullet here what to do.
Yeah.
I just want to live longer
Yeah.
and carry on and hope that something changes, something happens. So yeah, it's very stressful when you don't know what to do. Uh, I could break it all up and give some land for each child. I got 3 girls,
Yeah.
uh, but uh, I wanted to keep it as a unit, as a farm, and uh, yeah, I don't really have any questions,
Yep.
really, as such. It's just that probably a lot of people in my same boat, where you have uh, the people that what would be good is uh, if there was uh, if I had a son that could take over and let him deal with it when I am gone. But it's uh, it's kind of I do have one daughter that probably would be interested in taking over. Uh, yeah, it's no point me saying anymore because it's a situation that I think many people are in.
Yep, for sure.
You know, you got to think about taxes and all that. So yeah, I don't have any questions other than the fact that I'm just saying that I do have a problem with it, and losing a lot of sleep trying to figure out what to do. I guess that's about all I could say now.
Okay, there. Are we back in there? Sorry, it looks like I might have got kicked out there for a minute. But the idea being, I hope everybody can still hear me, that
Yep.
having the conversation and just trying to bring everybody together and see, is there anybody that would be interested? It's crazy how quickly time goes. And then before we know it, it's like even potential grandchildren. So, the idea of getting their thoughts and opinions too is, ultimately at the end of the day, like I said, it is going to be the parents that are going to make the final decision, as it should be. But getting some other input can always be a good starting point. It can be a challenging starting point too. There's no doubt about that. I see Annika, as we get quite close to wrapping up, if there was any questions or comments that she would have.
Hi, I really enjoyed this presentation. My husband and I farm just outside of Edmonton, Spruce Grove area.
Yes.
and we farm with his family. Yeah, but the transitioning, yeah, there's been a lot of moving parts you talked about, and it's a long story. And I'm in law, but I really enjoy learning about all of this transitioning. And my husband and I are hoping to be on our own at one point. I grew up on a farm in Manitoba, and so I'm really trying to learn as the younger generation right now how we can set up our farm really effectively. And I really appreciated the mission statement. And I think those are really good things for us to talk about right now. We do have our own business, and we're slowly getting assets into that, but we still farm with the family and are, yeah, trying to figure that out. So I just really appreciate all the knowledge that I can glean from the older generation and people in my boat as well, and what you had to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Annika. It makes me think of a couple of things from your comments is that, and I often say this right at the beginning, I didn't today, but, I think one thing is that just because we're family and that's okay too, right? And often I think coming together and going through this kind of process, I do know of one family that they had been a mixed operation. The father had developed it that way, but when it came right down to it, one of the sons was really more oriented towards grain farming, and the other one was the cattle. So that became quite a logical, way to split that up. Now, interestingly, as time has gone on, they've both become more mixed as their father had been. So anyway, that's beside the point. But, so then trying to figure out, then if we are somewhat working together and somewhat not, what does that look like? So even going so far as to have some kind of operating agreement, maybe things don't necessarily have to cross paths with a check, but at least they do with, for renting X number of acres at X value, then there'll be a trade for so many hours of equipment use or something like that. I think the more you can talk about those, the better, because, as I implied, sometimes time goes on and, somebody always assumed that they got use of the tractor and, for free. And then all of a sudden at the end of the day, I heard a story, not that the parents had passed away, and the one son had actually bought the farm from them prior to that, but the other siblings never knew. And so when it came to settle the parents' estate, they all came back thinking, I forget how many there was, 4 or something, that they were going to get a quarter of this, and not realizing that it had been transitioned a number of years ago. And the other thing too to really encourage is that you see the situations where there's the 80-year-old and the 60-year-old child, and the 80-year-old parent is still holding the purse strings, saying, one day this will all be yours. Well, that's not fair either. I don't think that the children should expect a handout, but they do need to have clarity on how it is going to transition, if it is. If it's not, that's fine too. So anyway, with that, we're getting to be a few minutes past.
So I guess maybe going back to Fred's point of view, there are a lot of farmers definitely in the area that don't have immediate family successors. And maybe even Pat can kind of go about how she met with their off-farm successors, or if you have a recommendation of like even how you approach further out family members. So looking at nieces, nephews, cousins, all that kind of stuff.
You want me to speak?
Yeah,
you want
sure.
me to speak to that?
Sure.
Well, this is a couple that Bill's kind of mentored the fellow right from when they first got out of university. So it's just been a gradual process of started out where he was just spending some time with us to learn the ropes. real ropes, I guess I should say, rather than the university ropes.
Yeah.
And yeah, the friendship developed, and they're very like-minded with us. So it's just been a really, natural progression. And we feel very fortunate to have this situation going, because neither of our kids are interested in the farm. So we would have had made, a much different decision if this family didn't sort of come in with us. So, it has its drawbacks, but on the other hand, we're getting to stay on the farm, and so there's lots of benefits to this relationship that we've developed. So, but yeah, it's really just been lucky for us that happened. I don't know if everybody would find themselves in the same situation, but I guess if you're open to it, though, if you're open to looking in your area, you never know what might develop. Hey.
And certainly, resources like Kelly at Lara, she has a lot of connections and people, and that might be one to say, hey, is there anybody out there that might take over on a rental basis or something like that? Kelly Nichipur, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do know quite a few young farmers who, I think, while they're in their transition period with their families, and I think when you have multiple siblings and not all of, like, if you have multiples that want to farm, there sometimes are I don't want to put it like winners or losers, but like sometimes the succession planning doesn't go exactly how they like it, and it gets transitioned to one sibling and not another. So I do know some young farmers that are interested in farming, but it's definitely something to think about on how to make those connections, for sure.
Yeah. So Fred, that could be something, is having a visit with Kelly at another time about some potential people, but certainly acknowledging that it is a difficult process. But as I mentioned a little bit on the contingency plan topic, it is easier to do it when you're not in crisis, and trying to be proactive about it. I really want to encourage people about, what should we do? And it's okay not to know, and it's okay to share that you don't know, that we've got to kind of come together to figure this out. So, yeah. Okay, well, if there is, we can have some more questions or comments if people want, but it is it's a little bit past that. So if people need to sign off, I can stay on for a few more minutes if we want to have a conversation, but certainly let people go that have, committed to being here for a certain amount of time. And, I guess another thing just to say, if there's any other, beyond succession planning or any other topics, just make sure you let Kelly Nichipuric know, because she's always excellent at accommodating people and helping producers with learning opportunities.